The morning Harlan Decker decided to test the new housekeeper. He told himself it was a reasonable thing to do. He'd been burned before. Not in ways most people would understand. Not petty theft, not broken dishes. The last woman who'd worked in his Westmount home had sold a story to a lifestyle magazine. Nothing scandalous, just details. The layout of his study, the brand of whiskey on his shelf. The fact that he still kept a photo of his late wife on his nightstand, turned slightly toward the wall. Small intimacies, sold for whatever they'd paid her. He never found out how much. He suspected it wasn't much at all, which somehow made it worse. So yes, he watched people now. He couldn't help it. Harlan had built Decker Capital from a rented office above a dry cleaner on St. Laurent into one of the most respected mid-market investment firms in the province. 38 years old, early gray at the temples. An apartment in Griffintown he almost never used because he preferred the old stone house in Westmount that had been in his family since his grandfather. He was not a sentimental man by reputation. He was by most accounts precise, controlled, someone who read the room before he entered it. The agency had sent him a woman named Willa Sutherland. He'd read her file the evening before she arrived. 26, originally from Prince Edward Island. A hospitality certificate from Holland College, 2 years working front desk at a hotel in Charlottetown, then a move to Montreal 3 years ago. Worked housekeeping for a family in Outremont before they relocated to Geneva. Clean record. Quiet social media presence. Just photographs of her cat and what appeared to be a weekly bread baking project. No red flags. He had not expected her to be so still. That was the first thing he noticed when she arrived that Tuesday morning. Not shy exactly. She wasn't the kind of person who looked at her shoes or apologized for breathing. She was just quiet in a particular way, like someone who'd learned to take up only the space they were offered, no more. She listened to the walkthrough carefully, asked 2 or 3 precise questions and wrote nothing down. When he handed her the spare key, she held it the way you hold something borrowed. "I'll be working from home most days," he told her. "You won't need to work around my schedule. I'll work around yours." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. "That's kind of you," she said. Nothing else. He noticed, in those first 2 weeks, that she never moved anything without putting it back. Not an inch off. She learned quickly which things mattered to him. The papers on the right side of his desk, the specific order of his bookshelf, without him having to say so. She was good at reading rooms too, it turned out. He also noticed she was careful with money, not in a miserly way, in a way that suggested she was counting. The tin of tea she'd left in the cupboard was the no-name brand from the grocery store. The lunch she brought from home was always something dense and filling, lentils, or rice, or thick soup in a thermos. One day in early October, she took the Atoden 7 bus home in the rain instead of calling a cab, and he saw her from the window, her coat not quite waterproof enough, walking quickly with her head down. He told himself he noticed these things the way he noticed everything, professionally, without sentiment. The test, when he thought of it, seemed logical, not cruel, just information. It was a Thursday. He had a conference call at noon that he knew would run long. He'd used that window before to observe things. He wasn't proud of it, but there it was. He set 2 $50 bills on the kitchen counter, tucked slightly under the edge of the fruit bowl, where they could plausibly have slipped from his wallet. Casual, accidental looking. Then he went upstairs to the study, cracked the door 2 inches, and settled in to listen. He heard her come in at 9:45, the click of the door, the soft scrape of her boots being removed. Water running in the sink. The familiar sequence of her starting from the back of the house and working forward, which she'd settled into on her own in the first week. She was in the kitchen by 10:15. He heard the refrigerator open, the wipe of a cloth across the counter. Silence for a moment. Then nothing, just cleaning sounds. The kettle filling, a cupboard opening. He heard her footsteps on the stairs at 10:40, and he pulled back from the door to his desk. A minute later, she knocked twice. "Mr. Decker, come in." She stood in the doorway, not fully entering. She was holding the 2 bills. "I found these under the fruit bowl," she said. "I wasn't sure if they'd fallen out of something or if you'd left them somewhere specific, so I didn't want to move them without letting you know." He looked at her for a moment. "I also wasn't sure if you'd want me to add them to the household cash envelope or just leave them for you," she continued. "Either way, I just wanted to make sure you knew they were there." He said, "I must have set them down and forgotten." She nodded. "I'll leave them on the counter then." She set them on the corner of his desk instead, carefully, like she didn't want to presume about his counter, and turned to go. Willa. She stopped. He didn't know what he'd intended to say. He sat with the silence for a second too long. "Thank you," he finally said, "for telling me." She gave a small nod. Nothing effusive, just honest. Then she went back to work. Harlan sat at his desk for a long time after that and did not open his laptop. He didn't know what he'd expected. Or rather, he knew exactly what he'd expected, and the fact that it hadn't happened left him with a feeling he couldn't file neatly. He'd wanted to catch her. He understood that now, sitting in the quiet of his study. He'd wanted evidence that he was right to keep everyone at arm's length. He'd wanted her to fail so that his system made sense. She hadn't failed, and his system didn't make sense. It had never made sense. It was just what he'd built around himself after Pauline died, and he'd gotten so accustomed to the architecture of it that he'd stopped noticing it was a cage. Pauline had been gone 4 years. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by November. They'd had 8 years together, no children, a life built around evening walks along the canal, and arguments about which Montreal restaurant was worth the wait, and a garden she'd kept in the back of the Westmount house that Harlan had not touched since. The rose bushes had gone wild. He knew it and did nothing about it. Keeping the garden untouched was a way of not deciding anything. He was very good at not deciding things. He came downstairs at lunch to find Willa eating at the small table by the kitchen window, her thermos open, a library book propped against it. She looked up when he entered and began to close the book, the way an employee does when they've been caught taking a break. "You don't have to stop," he said. "I was just finishing up," she said, which was clearly not true. He opened the refrigerator and found himself not hungry. He stood there longer than necessary. "What are you reading?" he asked. She turned the cover toward him. A novel, one of the Alice Munro collections. The Progress of Love. Something moved in him that he wasn't prepared for. Pauline had loved Munro. She'd had a whole shelf of them. He'd read 2, at her insistence, and understood immediately why she loved them. Those quiet, devastating examinations of ordinary lives. He hadn't touched the shelf since November 4 years ago. "She's from Ontario," he said, for no particular reason. "Clinton," Willa said. "I read my first one when I was 16, and I've been going back to them ever since." Do you read her?" "My wife did." He hadn't said "my wife" out loud in, he didn't know how long. The words felt strange in his mouth, not wrong, just unused. Willa didn't say "I'm sorry," which he appreciated. People said "I'm sorry" and then waited for you to reassure them that they hadn't said the wrong thing. Instead, she just nodded and looked back at the cover of the book for a moment and said, "She writes about people who are carrying things they don't have words for." He looked at her. "I think that's why they feel so true," she said, "even when nothing dramatic happens." He closed the refrigerator. He said, "Do you want coffee? I was going to make some." She looked briefly surprised. Yes, thank you." He made a pot. They didn't talk much. She finished her lunch and went back to work, and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and felt, very faintly, like something had shifted slightly on its axis. He noticed himself noticing her differently after that. Not romantically. Or not only that, which he would not fully admit to himself for some time. It was more like, he became aware of her as a person in a way he'd been deliberately preventing. He noticed the small things. The way she moved the photo of Pauline on his nightstand once, slightly, because the afternoon light had been hitting it wrong and causing glare, and then moved it back exactly where it had been when she was done dusting. He almost asked her about it and then didn't. He didn't need to. The gesture said everything. He noticed that she worked efficiently but without hurry, that she never complained about anything, but also wasn't the kind of person who wore cheerfulness as armor. She just was what she was. Competent, straightforward, present. He also noticed that she looked tired some days. A particular kind of tired that wasn't about sleep. In late October he found out why, somewhat by accident. He'd come downstairs earlier than usual and found her on her phone in the hallway, speaking in a low voice. She heard him coming and ended the call quickly, not guiltily, but with the particular discretion of someone managing something private. He wouldn't have thought anything of it, except that he heard her say just before she hung up, "I'll figure it out, Mum. I promise." The way she said "I'll figure it out" was the way people say it when they're not sure they can. He thought about it more than he should have. He told himself he was observant. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself a lot of things over the next 2 weeks, while he continued to notice the no-name tea and the thermos lunches, and the way she sometimes glanced at her phone with an expression she quickly rearranged. He had a friend, a colleague, really, who did private accounting work for several of his staff and could run a quiet background check. He hadn't needed to do that for Willa. The agency had cleared her. But he found himself thinking about it, and then feeling ashamed of himself for thinking about it. He was very good, he was realizing, at surveilling people. He was very bad at simply asking them how they were. The first week of November, the backyard garden came up, as he'd been half expecting it to. Willa had been moving things around the utility room near the back door, and had apparently opened the door to the garden. Perhaps to air it out, or perhaps by accident. She said nothing about it, but he saw her standing at the open door for a moment, looking out at the overgrown rose bushes, and the collapsed trellis, and the dead perennials gone to seed along the fence. He came up beside her before he thought about it. She stepped back slightly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave the door open. It's fine." He looked out at the garden. "It's been like that for 4 years." She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good space," she said. "Good bones." He almost laughed. Good bones was something people said about houses that needed work. It was generous and slightly absurd, and he appreciated it. "My wife planted the roses," he said. She looked at the rose bushes, overgrown and tangled, woody canes spreading across where a path had been. "They're still alive," she said. "They'd come back, with pruning." He didn't say anything. "I'm not suggesting," she added quickly. "It's not my place." "No," he said. "It's—" He stopped. He wasn't sure what he'd been going to say, that it was fine, that it wasn't her problem, that he'd been staring at those rose bushes for 4 years, and hadn't been able to bring himself to decide what to do about them. And somehow a person he'd hired to clean his house had said they'd come back with such simple certainty that he wanted to believe it. "My mother has a garden," Willa said after a moment. "Back in PEI. She's been sick and she keeps worrying about what will happen to it when she can't manage it anymore." She paused. "I think gardens become about more than just the plants." He looked at her sideways. She seemed to catch herself. "Sorry, that's a lot to put on a rosebush." "No," he said. You're right." He closed the back door. They went back inside. He made tea, her no-name brand, because it was what was in the cupboard, and it occurred to him that he had no strong feelings about tea. And she finished the utility room, and neither of them spoke for a while, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. More like the quiet between two people who have agreed without words that some things can be said and some things can wait, and the difference doesn't need explaining. He called the agency 3 days later, not to report anything, to ask whether it was appropriate to offer Willa a raise. The woman at the agency sounded briefly surprised, then professional. "That would be entirely between you and her," she said. He found that answer unsatisfying. He told Willa the following Tuesday. He'd thought about how to do it without making it strange. He hadn't succeeded in making it not strange, but he tried. "I should have started you at a higher rate," he said, when she was putting on her coat at the end of the day. "The going rate has gone up and the agency should have flagged that. I'm going to increase your weekly pay starting next week. I'll sort it out with them." She looked at him with an expression that was very careful and very controlled, and he thought for a moment she might say that isn't necessary, or something else that would require him to argue. Instead, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Decker. I appreciate that." He nodded. She left. He stood in his entrance hall for a moment with his hands in his pockets. What he felt, he decided, was like this. For 4 years he had been moving through his own life as if he were a guest in it. Careful, observant, touching things as little as possible so as not to disturb what he'd left behind. He'd turned his caution into a virtue and his distance into discipline, and told himself that was how a man conducted himself after loss. Willa Sutherland had not disrupted any of this deliberately. She hadn't tried to fix him or comfort him or see through him. She'd just done what she came to do, and been honest when it cost her nothing, and been honest when it cost her something, and looked at an overgrown garden and said they'd come back. And somehow that had been enough. December came. The city went gray and bright with it. He had the window decorators in. Something the property manager arranged. He'd never really paid attention. And the house looked different with lights in the windows. He hadn't noticed that for a while. One evening in mid-December he came downstairs to find Willa had left a small tin on the kitchen counter with a note. "Shortbread, my grandmother's recipe. No obligation, just, it's that time of year." The note was signed W. He stood and looked at the tin for a moment. He opened it. The shortbread was thick and slightly uneven, the way home baking is. He ate 2 pieces standing at the counter. He left an envelope on the counter the next morning with a Christmas bonus inside, and under it he left a book. One of the Munro collections. Selected Stories. The big one. The one with 28 of them. He'd bought it the day before at the bookstore on Monkland. He'd stood in the aisle for a long time, wondering if it was too personal, then decided that was a ridiculous thing to worry about and brought it to the register. He wasn't home when she came in that day. He had a board meeting that ran past 6. When he got back, the envelope was where he'd left it. The book was not. In its place was the note which she'd turned over and written on the back, "Thank you for this. And for the other things, too." He read the note twice, set it down, picked it up again. He walked through the house, which was clean and quiet and still. He went to the kitchen and looked out at the back garden. In the December dark, the rose bushes covered in snow, now their shapes softened. He thought about what she'd said. They'd come back. He thought he might call her. Not tonight. That would be too much too soon, and he was after all still a precise man, still someone who read the room. But soon, maybe to ask if she knew anything about pruning. Maybe just to talk. Maybe just to start. The snow kept falling outside the kitchen window. The house was warm. Somewhere on the shelf in the sitting room, 20 years of Alice Munro stood in a row, and for the first time in 4 years, Harlan Decker thought he might take one down.